It's the movie that convinced an entire generation that a limousine, a credit card, and the right hotel manager could rewrite anyone's life. Pretty Woman is remembered as the ultimate modern fairy tale, a glossy love story wrapped in couture and Roy Orbison's guitar riff. But underneath the roses and the red dress sits a production history that is far stranger, far darker, and far more chaotic than the finished film ever let on. This is the real story of what almost never made it to screen, the accidents that became iconic, and the secrets Disney would rather you forget. Before it was Pretty Woman, it was called simply 3000. That number wasn't a release year or a code name. It was the dollar figure a wealthy businessman offers a sex worker to spend a week as his companion, and screenwriter J.F. Lawton never intended it to be charming. His script was a bleak, unglamorous look at class and survival on the streets of Los Angeles. In interviews years later, Lawton described a version of the story where Vivian's character had a drug habit, and part of the arrangement with Edward was that she stay clean for the week they spent together. There was no rescue fantasy waiting at the end. When their week was up, Edward tossed her out of his car along with the cash he owed her and drove off, leaving her standing in an alley. In the earliest drafts, the film didn't even end there. It closed with Vivian and her friend Kit riding a city bus toward Disneyland, staring blankly out the window, having earned just enough money to buy a day of forgetting. Julia Roberts herself has talked about reading that original screenplay long before she became a star. In a conversation with fellow actress Patricia Arquette, who had also auditioned for the lead when it was still 3000, Roberts remembered the tone as unflinchingly heavy, something closer to an independent art film than a studio date-night movie. She recalled the scene where Edward throws her out of the car and the money on top of her, and admitted she had no business being in a movie like that at the time. Ironically, the production company behind that first version folded before it ever got made, leaving her briefly without the job. The film also carried other threads that never survived the transition to a studio romance. Beyond the addiction storyline, early drafts leaned harder into the transactional, almost business-like nature of Vivian and Edward's arrangement, treating their week together as closer to a negotiation between strangers than a courtship. There was little room in that version for warmth, and even less for hope. It was the kind of screenplay meant to unsettle audiences, not send them home humming a love theme. It took Walt Disney Studios, and specifically then-President Jeffrey Katzenberg, to see commercial potential buried inside the wreckage. Katzenberg pushed for a full reinvention, strip out the addiction storyline, soften Edward from a cold predator into a wounded workaholic, and turn the ending into something audiences would leave the theater smiling about. Even the title had to go. According to director Gary Marshall, test audiences given only the title 3000 assumed the film was some kind of science fiction premise about space travel. 5 writers eventually worked on the rewrite, but it was Barbara Benedek, the sole woman among them, who cracked the trickiest problem: how to make Edward likable. She reportedly modeled him loosely on real-world corporate raiders of the era, but gave him a vulnerability the original character never had. What started as a cautionary tale about power and exploitation became, scene by scene, rewrite by rewrite, the ultimate Hollywood fantasy. It's hard to picture anyone else as Vivian Ward, yet Julia Roberts was nowhere close to a lock for the role. The casting search stretched on for months and pulled in a staggering list of names. Molly Ringwald turned the part down, later saying something about the premise felt uncomfortable to her. Winona Ryder and Jennifer Connelly both auditioned, but were passed over for being considered too young for the material. Drew Barrymore, Patricia Arquette, Brooke Shields, Uma Thurman, and Kristen Davis all read for the role at various points. Diane Lane came remarkably close, going as far as costume fittings during an era when the script was still much darker, before scheduling conflicts pulled her away. Meg Ryan, the studio's top choice and Gary Marshall's as well, ultimately said no. Even Mary Steenburgen was floated as an early possibility. Some of the near misses came down to nothing more than timing, and others came down to actresses simply not wanting anything to do with the material. What all of those additions and near castings underline is just how uncertain the studio was about who could carry a story this tonally slippery, a film that needed to be funny, sexy, and sympathetic all at once without ever tipping into parody or exploitation. The bathtub scene, where Vivian sings along to Prince's Kiss and slides underwater in a fit of joy, plays like effortless charm on screen. Behind the camera, it was a small disaster. To get bubbles thick enough to hold up under hot studio lighting, the crew relied on an unusually strong detergent. It worked exactly as intended for the bubbles, but it stripped the red dye clean out of Roberts' hair by the end of the day. She recalled walking off set and being asked by her own hairstylist why her hair suddenly looked blonde, which meant an emergency late-night dye job just to keep continuity for the next day of filming. Then, there was the moment everyone remembers, Vivian ducking her head underwater and resurfacing to an empty room. That part really happened, but it wasn't an accident. Roberts was uncomfortable with even the mild nudity the scene required, so Gary Marshall staged a prank to break the tension. As she went under, he quietly had the entire crew slip off the set, leaving only the camera operator behind. When she came back up and realized everyone was gone, her shock and her laughter were completely unscripted, caught on film exactly as they happened. It became one of the most naturally funny beats in the entire movie, born entirely out of a director trying to calm a nervous young actress rather than director. Few moments in Pretty Woman are as beloved as Edward snapping the jewelry case shut on Vivian's fingers just as she reaches for the necklace inside, sending her into genuine, startled laughter. That reaction wasn't written into the script. Roberts had been running on very little sleep and was struggling to find the right energy for the scene, so Marshall quietly suggested to Richard Gere that he improvise something to catch her off guard. The lid snap worked so well that her laugh was completely real enough that even the security guard hired to watch over the actual jewelry, on loan from a real jeweler and worth a genuine fortune, reportedly laughed along with her. Marshall liked the take so much he kept it in the final cut rather than reshooting for something more polished. That wasn't the only piece of unplanned magic tied to that scene. The piano melody Edward plays in the hotel lounge wasn't performed by a session musician standing in for Gere. Gere actually composed the piece himself and played it on camera, a small detail that few viewers ever clock, but one that added a layer of authenticity to a character who could easily have felt like nothing more than a rich man in a suit. Roberts' laughter shows up again earlier in the film, during the scene where Vivian lounges on the floor watching reruns of I Love Lucy. That laugh, too, was manufactured through an old-fashioned trick. Marshall tickled her feet just out of camera range until she genuinely cracked up. It became something of a pattern on set. Whenever the film needed real, unforced joy from its lead actress, the director found a way to surprise it out of her rather than simply asking for it. It's strange to imagine now, given how tightly Richard Gere's name is bound to this role, but he very nearly turned it down entirely. Gere reportedly saw the material as a shallow story about money standing in for real connection and passed on it more than once before ever meeting Roberts in person. According to the well-known account from the set, it was a single moment that changed his mind. During a meeting arranged by Marshall, Roberts slipped Gere a small note reading, "Please say yes." Gere has said that whatever passed between them in that moment convinced him on the spot, and he called Marshall that same night to accept the role. Once on set, Gere brought more of himself to the part than audiences realized, from the piano composition to his willingness to lean into physical comedy in scenes where Edward is completely out of his depth in Vivian's world, most memorably during the visit to the Blue Banana Bar. What started as a role he didn't want became one of the defining performances of his career, built on a single note and a leap of faith. The gap between the finished film and its darker roots didn't disappear with a single rewrite. Deleted material, later uncovered and included on an anniversary DVD release, shows just how much grittier the story once was. In one surviving deleted scene, Vivian tells Edward flatly that she could just pop you good, a blunt line that signals none of the soft romantic chemistry the final film leans on. Another cut sequence involves Vivian being confronted by a drug dealer and rescued by Edward's limo driver, a leftover thread from the storyline where her character struggled with addiction before the studio decided that arc worked against making her sympathetic. Producer Laura Ziskin ultimately made the call that this material undercut the audience's ability to root for Vivian, and those threads were quietly reassigned to her friend Kit or removed altogether. Even the original ending itself, tested with real audiences before release, was rejected outright. Viewers reacted badly to Vivian and Kit simply riding off to Disneyland with a pocket full of cash and no real resolution to the romance. That reaction sent the production back to the drawing board, ultimately landing on the Fire Escape Rescue audience's Know Today, a finale built specifically because test screenings demanded something warmer than the story originally offered. Julia Roberts' red gown, worn to the opera in the film's most transformative scene, is now recognized as one of the most iconic dresses in film history, but it almost wasn't red at all. Costume designer Marilyn Vance built the character's entire wardrobe arc as a visual journey from streetwalker to sophisticate, and when it came time to design the opera gown, Gary Marshall pushed for black, worried that a red dress would clash badly against Roberts' red hair. Vance disagreed and refused to back down. She ended up creating 3 different versions of a dress in different shades and put Roberts through multiple screen tests specifically to prove her case to Marshall. The gamble paid off. The finished scarlet gown, an off-the-shoulder column dress with a plunging neckline, became instantly iconic and earned Vance a BAFTA nomination for costume design. What the studio wanted safe, she made bold, and that dress has outlived the film itself in fashion retrospectives, museum exhibits, and countless imitations sold decades later. One of the more uncomfortable footnotes in the film's legacy involves its marketing rather than its story. The now famous poster image of Vivian and Edward standing back to back, her in thigh-high boots and a mini skirt, doesn't actually show Julia Roberts' body. The figure in that shot belongs to model and actress Donna Scoggins, with Roberts' face superimposed onto her for the final image. It wasn't an isolated substitution either. Within the film itself, some of Vivian's body shots were performed by a different body double, Shelley Michelle, who has spoken publicly about her work doubling for a number of major actresses during that period of Hollywood filmmaking. The practice wasn't scandalous by industry standards at the time. Body doubling for promotional photography and select shots was common, and often driven by the simple logistics of reassembling a full cast for a dedicated photo shoot after a production has already wrapped. Still, when the substitution became public knowledge, it added an odd footnote to a film so closely associated with one woman's face and name. The ending audiences know, Edward arriving with roses, conquering his fear of heights to climb the fire escape to Vivian's window, feels like it was always meant to be. In truth, it was one of the last major pieces to fall into place. With test audiences rejecting the bleak Disneyland bus ending and softer studio rewrites still falling flat, Gary Marshall reportedly stayed up late one night and rewrote the finale himself, transforming a story that ends in abandonment into one that ends in rescue and reciprocity. When he shared the new pages with the cast, it reportedly moved Roberts to tears. That late-night rewrite became the emotional backbone of the entire film, turning a story that began as a meditation on money and power into one remembered for love and second chances. When Pretty Woman opened in March of 1990, nobody, including the studio that nearly buried its darker origins entirely, expected the scale of what followed. The film grossed roughly $463 million worldwide against a modest budget of around $14 million, making it the highest-grossing romantic comedy of its era and, for years afterward, the highest-grossing R-rated film Disney had ever released. Julia Roberts, only 23 at the time, became an overnight sensation, earning a Golden Globe win and an Academy Award nomination for a role that had been rewritten, recast, and reworked more times than almost anyone involved could count. The Beverly Wilshire Hotel, where much of the film's interior and exterior hotel footage was actually shot, became a real-world tourist destination almost overnight, eventually building an entire Pretty Woman package for guests wanting to relive the film's glamour in person. The chemistry between Roberts and Gere proved strong enough that Gary Marshall reunited them nearly a decade later for Runaway Bride, again cast